I ran into a woman who spoke yesterday who just blew my socks off. And her name is Jaribu Hill, and we're going to get to know her a little bit and find out what she's all about.
Okay.
Thank you for being on my show.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right.
Okay, I am actually working in the state of Mississippi,
okay,
where my entire family originally comes from,
yeah.
the Mississippi Delta. We started an organization called the Mississippi Worker Center for Human Rights,
right.
And the reason we started that organization was solidarity and educational support for low-wage African-American workers and other workers who are basically rendered invisible in the state of Mississippi and across the Deep South.
And how have you been successful in that regard?
Well, we've been successful as much as any organization can be in such a hostile work environment, in such a hostile climate as Mississippi, which is, of course, one of the bastions of race and class and any other kind of oppression that you can imagine.
Yeah.
And the history there of staunch adherence to chattel slavery and other forms of bondage control still persists today. Although people have to be paid meager wages, the remnants and badges of slavery still exist to this day.
You know, people got Katrina, besides the devastation that it brought here, put sort of the international attention on New Orleans and actually what had been going on for years. We had an initial, disaster that came from the heavens, but in fact there had been a man-made or human-made disaster that's been going on for a really long time in terms of equality, economic injustice, and it sort of brought all that to light. And particularly how not only, you're talking local racism, but how the national government was just abominable in how it treated the people here. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and I think you are absolutely on point when you say that the kinds of conditions that we looked at after Katrina had in fact existed for decades. African Americans who formed approximately 30% of the population living in relentless, stubborn poverty. The unemployment rate was very high. There was a question around, an issue around Jim Crow schools, lack of equality in terms of education. People were basically on the margins before Katrina. And what Katrina did was expose the lack of equality, expose institutionalized racism and class oppression in ways that it had not been exposed before in this region. This region was known as a playland for Mardi Gras and the mystique around Mardi Gras, the masks and the costumes. That was really what people associated. When they talked about New Orleans, that's what they thought about. And so no one really ever thought about the conditions described after Katrina unless they lived in those conditions. Right. Everyone else was here as a tourist, and even when we came for meetings right. as political activists, we came to the hotels, right. we met there, and we left. But 28% or more of the population was living in absolute abject poverty before Katrina. They were most of the people who were abandoned. Yeah. They were the people who drowned because they didn't have transportation.
That's right.
And George Curry, who was the editor of a wonderful magazine called Emerge, cited that in a presentation he made in Mississippi right after Katrina, where he said over 55% of the African American and poor population had no cars at all. So they could not escape. They could not escape their fate. They could not escape being turned into people who were fighting, literally fighting for their lives and trying to be saved from drowning. Yeah. And they also could not escape the fate of being abandoned by both FEMA and the Red Cross. And the abandonment was so stark and so just absolutely outrageous that you thought that at least they could make an attempt to finesse it or cover it up in some way. Yeah. But just blatant abandonment, blatant assignments to go to areas that were privileged and white, as opposed to going to areas where people really, really needed the help and the relief.
Yeah.
And the only help and relief that we really got after Katrina, both in terms of the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which is a whole nother issue of why the media didn't evenly cover the quote-unquote disaster. In fact, they did not. They developed an aura around New Orleans that was almost like an eroticized sort of account of New Orleans. But they said nothing about Alabama. They said nothing about Mississippi.
Yeah.
The areas where people also were engulfed in Katrina were not even looked at. I saw one human interest story about the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
Yeah.
That was an elderly man who was talking about how he had to let go of his wife's hand in their house, which was full of water, and she said, save the grandchildren.
Yeah.
And that is the only story that I saw as I watched hours and hours of footage. That and the fact that every black person trying to get a little bit of food, trying to get a little bit of water was called a looter, and white people were simply finding food.
Right.
So
Exactly.
these kinds of issues were already there before Katrina, and for some people who basically had not wanted to deal with them before, they were shocked and amazed.
Yeah.
For those of us who live that reality every day, from one end of this country to the other, it was more of the same.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about media attention, and media attention, you know, in at least U.S. history, to some degree, at times, has actually helped push us in a good direction. Like the civil rights movement, for instance, the videos of Alabama police beating up civil rights people over the head, all that stuff with George Wallace really did, you know, at least, I mean, at the time it was terrible, but actually had a positive impact. It you know, made all these insulated white people go, oh my God, that's horrible. And you saw, I mean, one of the founders of the National Lawyers Guild, Arthur Kenoy,
Absolutely.
got dragged out. Arthur used to say, and I was
famous
I was a
photo.
friend of Arthur. He said it was more effective than any litigation I ever did when some big U.S. Marshals dragged me out of the House Un-American Committee, and this little guy was on the front page.
And he was representing Adam Clayton Powell Jr.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
At the front page of the New York Times.
Yes, and it's on the cover of his book
Yeah.
as well.
So everybody is really aware of the whole Super Bowl fiasco where George Bush was out there partying with his white friends, and for 4 days people were in torturous conditions, and everybody watched it on national TV, and everybody just couldn't believe it. Did that have any effect? Have you seen any positive effects from that, you know, media-focused disaster?
I have to say it's been minimal.
Minimal.
I'll say that there was exposure, there were images that were startling and frightening and horrifying for people. But as far as government accountability, that is the piece that is still missing. See, when you talk about recovery, most of the recovery has been done by the faith community, and now through Brad Pitt and other celebrities by the celebrity community. And people basically just pulling it together themselves, grabbing whatever insurance dollars they could get after being told that it was a flood instead of a windstorm or whatever they were saying, to try to keep people from recovering on premiums they had paid. Those are the types of elements of recovery that we've seen. Governmental recovery has been slow. Under the Bush administration, governmental recovery was non-existent. And now, under President Obama's administration, you see some governmental accountability, you see some resources coming to the region that were not coming before, but it's still not sufficient. It's still not where it should be in terms of how the richest country in the whole wide world operates after a storm. And I'll say a storm because a storm is a force of the creator. The disaster comes when greed and exploitation kick in. Prior to that, it's rain, it's wind, it's flooding, it's waters that are overwhelming an area. That's all part of the balance of nature. But when you take that and you don't use the tools that you have for recovery, then it becomes a disaster. Then it becomes a living nightmare for those who have to live through it.